Okay, I'm gonna hit the broadcast button and get us set up so people can start logging in. Okay, good luck, everyone.
Thanks. All right. To our University Press Week hangout on opening access, the reinvention of the academic book. My name is Jennifer Howard. I'm a senior reporter with the Chronicle of Higher Education. I write a lot about publishing and libraries. And with me today are several distinguished panelists who all have interesting careers in publishing and in scholarship. In alphabetical order, we have Matthew K. Gold, an associate professor of English and Digital Humanities at the Graduate Center at CUNY. He's one of the editors of Debates in the Digital Humanities, which began life as a book published by the University of Minnesota Press, and has now evolved into an open access publication stream online with more and more layers of commentary. He's also a driving force behind the Manifold Scholarship Project, which is a Mellon-funded partnership between CUNY and the University of Minnesota Press to build a platform for university presses to publish what they're calling iterative scholarship, which is a concept I hope we'll get into as this hour unfolds. Frances Pinter has extensive experience in publishing both traditional and open access scholarly books. She's the founder and executive director of Knowledge Unlatched, which is a nonprofit that gets libraries to pool resources to pay publishers to make certain books open access. They're now in round 2 of that experiment, featuring 78 books from 26 publishers. Frances was the founding publisher. Peter Suber, who's a philosopher and a prominent open access advocate. I'm sure many, if not most of you, know his work. He's the director of the Harvard Office for Scholarly Communication. He's also director of Harvard's Open Access Project at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, where he's a senior researcher. He's also a University Press author. He's the author of a book called Open Access, published by MIT Press. It's available in several open access editions and also in a streaming edition from the Internet Archive. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for this discussion. And audience, we'd love to hear from you. Please tweet us your questions or put questions in the, there's a little Q&A interface in the Hangout, maybe a little hard to find, but I think we can manage. Or just tweet at me and we'll figure it out. But please weigh in with comments and questions. So our topic, opening access. What does access mean? Well, probably when a lot of people hear access, they think open access as a business model, or as Peter would probably point out, a set of business models in many different iterations. So I think maybe we should get things off by starting talk about money. Money is, you know, how do you make books open access? What does it cost? What kind of models are you seeing? Why is it something? Is it something that has been hard for publishers, and if so, why? Peter, do you want to start us off? We may have some Peter, we're having trouble hearing you. Can you
hear me?
Yes, Frances, do you want to?
Well, while Sarah's trying to work out Peter's problem, shall I have a go at some of the economic issues?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I think we have a real problem with the concept of the book, because it just is so many different things. And we also have a problem with the concept of publisher, because there's so many different types of publishers. So you can't really talk about Elsevier and, say, a small university press in the same breath. So I think we need to be careful that we're talking about monographs. But monographs are really exciting in the digital age because you can do so many things with them. And so we have to start with the economics of the old and say, what's wrong with those economics? And in my view, the problem is the legacy structures of not just publishers, but also the intermediaries and the libraries, everything that makes the status quo the status quo. It is breaking down, and that is very exciting, and there are many ways of making open access work. And I think somewhere Peter said something which I absolutely agree with, that there is no one model to open access. There are many models that will get you to open access. And it's really very simple. Publishing costs money. However you do it, whether you're doing it yourself or you're doing it through a publisher or you're doing it through a library, it all costs money because it's very labor intensive. And once you figure out how much does it cost, where are you going to get the money to pay for it, it should be open. And there are several models that you can go down that route with.
You want to tell us a little bit about Knowledge Unlatched's approach to that particular problem, of how you make this thing work financially?
Okay, so we've taken the view that people academics would like their books to be open, and publishers would like to make them open. And it's a collaborative arrangement with publishers and libraries. And libraries are using their acquisitions budgets, instead of buying closed books, to put into a pot some money to pay for the origination costs. So by that I mean all the costs getting to first digital file. And there are lots of arguments over exactly how much this is, because it actually has to include overhead, and that differs from company to company, and what they do and how they do it, and how long the book is and how complicated the book is. But essentially, we've managed to get agreement that the libraries will pool together, and if enough libraries pool together, then the cost per library is actually less than buying a closed book. So they're doing good and getting a good deal. And we're learning. We're learning as we go through the iterations to fine-tune the model.
Peter, are you?
Let me try. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, good. That worked. Thanks, Frances, because that's a better way to start the answer. Frances's model is successful. There are several other successful models. As she pointed out, open access is not a kind of business model, it's a kind of access. There are different ways to pay for the model. It looks like I just blinked out again. Am I still on?
Yes.
No, I see you.
We can hear you. Yeah.
I see.
And I've started a list at the Open Access Directory of known book business models for open access, and right now there are 14. So I can steer people to that if they want some detail. And because it's a wiki, they can help bring it up to date with new examples and new models that we currently omit. But if I could use this occasion to respond to one of the questions in our list. Somebody asked, how can we pay writers in the age of open access books? And this is slightly different from the business model that pays the publisher. How do we pay authors? The short answer is authors of academic monographs have really not been paid. If they're superstars, they make significant royalties, but if they're not, their royalties are between meager and zero. And once they realize that, they should not be afraid of the risks to their royalties of open access. There are essentially no risks to their royalties because there are no royalties to put at risk. And the benefits of open access easily outweigh the risk to those royalties.
Yeah, I'm curious, maybe this might be a question for Matt and Augusta as the scholars. Well, you're a scholar too, Peter, of course, but do authors generally want open access now? Is this an increasingly widespread desire among authors?
Well, I think before we get to that part of the consideration, just to get to what Peter was just saying, it's true, authors, particularly academic authors, don't really, royalties are not hanging in the balance. What's hanging in the balance is the promotion, and that's how you get paid. And I think, again, like just being really frank and upfront about that this is a service model that's serving a number of different businesses, actually, right? Not simply the publishing business, but also the academy itself. So just kind of wanted to put that very point blank into the conversation. And I think that authors, really, as far as academic authors, everyone, I don't know anyone who writes anything who doesn't want it to be read broadly. And I think the question is, for me, and this kind of veers over into the intellectual stuff, is really how we write those books to get more and more readers, to understand what that takes and what are the changes we need to make. That's something that I think really animates a lot of my thinking.
Okay.
And I would just say that, I think Peter's description of 14 different business models for making open access work points to the need for continued experimentation along these lines. I'm particularly interested in how texts that are open access are also generating revenue through print sales. I think the benefits that Peter talked about, increased readership, increased discussion around various texts. I've certainly seen through some of the texts I've been involved in increased conversation around those topics and those texts through open access. And I think thinking about how those can connect to continued sales of print books is something we need to continue to explore.
Matt, one question I have.
Sorry.
Do questions, does increased conversation translate to increased sales? Do we have any evidence for that?
We do. We do acknowledge Unlatched. The numbers are small, and we're gathering them up from different publishers, but it's definitely the case in the hundreds of titles that we've been looking at from different publishers that a number of things happen. Firstly, the downloads are just mind-boggling, because these are books that sell a few hundred copies, and now they're being downloaded in 167 countries. Fabulous. And over 1,000, 1,500 times per annum in the first year. And we're also seeing the downloads increase per book per annum over the years if it's the right book and it's meeting the needs of the community. So that's something you could never see with the printed book. So that's very exciting for us. And authors, the testimonials that we get about the what it's meant for them to have their book read by the audience they really want to get to.
I was going to ask, how do you know when a book is the right book for an open access presentation?
At least a dozen publishers have said what Frances just said. They themselves have evidence from their own records that open access full text editions help stimulate the sales of the print editions. It's hard to do a controlled experiment because you can't make the same book open and non-open at the same time. But insofar as we can get indirect leverage on this, more than a dozen publishers have found that evidence. And this has intrigued other publishers, especially university presses, enough that they're doing the experiments themselves to see if they can gather that evidence in-house. The last time I checked, more than 25% of university presses in the United States were running experiments with full-text, open-access books coexisting with print editions. Let me use this occasion to call on them to share their data. If they find that sometimes they do stimulate the sales of print editions, please tell us, and if sometimes they don't, tell us. One thing we're trying to work out is when this works and when it doesn't. It doesn't seem to work for all books, but if it works for some books, let's get more specific and detailed about which ones.
Peter, among the 14 business open access models that you have collected, are there any that are particularly good or not good for university presses? Is there anything that really jumps out as something presses should consider?
Well, some university presses are trying the APC model. That's article processing charge in the world of books, but you could have a book processing charge. I don't know how successful they are in getting these charges paid. In the case of articles, they run between $300 and $3,000 or $5,000, but in the case of a book, they run between $15,000 and $25,000. And obviously, they're much harder for authors to arrange. They don't have that money themselves. Sometimes, or usually, their university does not have it. Very often, their grant does not have it. But it's a model that some are trying out just in case somebody has the money. And I welcome some evidence about how often there's uptake on that. But there are other possibilities as well. There are subsidy models. There are the Frances KU model, in which you get many libraries to chip in on the costs of books and actually reduce the cost per contributor below the retail price of a non-open access book.
So what's holding, aside from money, are there factors that might hold a press back from experimenting with open access?
Well, money is one thing, but risk about money is something else. Because in fact, the money might be there, but as long as you worry about risk, then it hardly matters that the money might be there. And I think there's a lot of worry about risk. At the same time, that worry is balanced by, call it pressure, to try something different, because university presses are under threat no matter what they do. And one reason why I think at least a quarter of U.S. presses are trying open access is because they're feeling this pressure. And the publication of conventional books at conventional prices is not working for them, or there's a decline there. So they've got to try something new. If open access can actually bring in revenue and spread readers and impact, that would be a double win.
Mm-hmm. Can I just add one little point there as a university press publisher? There is another factor, and that is just we need a bit of time to get the right people with the right skills, because the workflow is different. And that takes leadership in the university presses to actually implement.
I would just add to that. So my project, Manifold Scholarship, which is sponsored by the Mellon Foundation, is an example of the kind of workflow and expertise that I think, and partnerships that are necessary to think about new platforms for publishing open access. Because of course, when we talk about open access, we could potentially be talking about anything from a PDF of a printed text made public to a complex interactive platform for sharing a text. And I think that latter type of open access publishing requires a new paradigm, and often new partnerships that might, in our case, it involves a digital humanities lab and a software development company partnering with a press that is also thinking internally about its own publishing workflows and how they need to change in order to take account of digital scholarship. So I think I would say that the question goes even beyond open access as a kind of baseline into what digital publishing looks like on the web and through networks.
That was a theme in all of the conversations I had with you all ahead of this event. That really came up, the idea of using the digital environment to capture the fluidity of scholarship, and looking at the book as one point on a spectrum of scholarly and publishing activities. And I'm not sure how that works as a business model exactly, but that's the idea that we might be trying to capture, or opening up not just the access to the content, but the way in which the content is created and presented. So Manifold Scholarship is an effort to build something that other presses could then use, right? Kind of solve the technological piece. Okay.
That's right. So we're building a platform. It's one of a suite of grants given by the Mellon Foundation to spur innovation around the open access monograph. And what we're planning is and building is a platform that will be shared in an open access format for other presses to experiment with, and that's being designed from the ground up as a kind of network space for books to be shared and interacted with.
And Peter, you've done something like that with your own book, right? You've had kind of a layered, Prim multi-edition sort of approach.
Yes, in fact, that's one reason I'm so fascinated by Manifold Scholarship. I'm really looking forward to it. But when my book came out on open access in 2012, it was short to begin with, and I had to omit many studies and discussions of many subtopics. Moreover, there were new things coming out all the time, and I didn't want the documentation to become obsolete. So I started a web page of updates and supplements, and I've been adding to it ever since. There are over 400 of those updates and supplements now. They constitute about 80% of the size of the original book. And one thing I like about it is that it keeps the book alive, and it's basically up to date if you take the accompanying web page into account. Another thing I like about it, I have to admit, is that it's solely up to me. MIT Press vetted the book, but it's not vetting my updates and supplements. So I get to say whatever I want in those updates and supplements. And of course, the book was not open access from birth. It was open access 12 months after publication, but the updates and supplements are open access from birth. So it's like a companion book to the book, and I get to say whatever I want to keep it up to date. And I've arranged things so that each supplement links to the page that it's annotating or supplementing, and each page of the book can link to the supplements about it. So I integrate them as well as I can without publishing a unified edition. But maybe Manifold Scholarship would be the platform that would let me create a unified edition.
Well, I would just say that what you've just described is what we're trying to capture and take account of, which is what we're calling iterative scholarship. You know, the way scholars work, our ideas develop over time. We need to update our work, and as we think about new platforms for publishing, I think collectively we need to think about how we can think beyond the sort of the package form of the book into networked versions that take account of the way our ideas develop over time.
Yes, I would even say my book is fairly conventional or conservative from a publishing point of view. It's just a book, but your platform allows the evolution of the category of books, and my book plus the web page is just a book plus a web page. I like the way your concept will allow truly dynamic or living books that don't simply consist of frozen text plus supplements, but a brand new category altogether. It might be crowdsourced, in which people are continually revising, improving, and enlarging it, or it might be something quite different, in which we get dynamic illustrations and charts that can take input from readers, or even commentary and dialogue between readers and authors.
It sounds fascinating and wonderful in many ways. It also sounds like a lot of work, either for the authors or the publishers. And if I were a University Press person who'd put a lot of money and time into helping create a recognizably good scholarly book, I might be concerned about opening up, what are these bells, what are these other layers that are being thrown in here, who's in charge, who's vetting them, who has to archive them and preserve them. Are these lines going to be, how do you manage that in this iterative universe?
Well, I would say, for our example, and I would love, to hear from other panelists about their thoughts too. We are this project is an experiment in building the platform for a network iterative book, but it's also an experiment for the press in how it thinks about these projects to take account of the issues you've just raised. Obviously, sustainability is a huge issue. Hosting is an issue, and I think that as we move forward, we need to publish. We need to. What the press is doing is they are, through this grant, hiring a digital projects editor, and I think that even that title, projects editor, rather than digital books editor, is indicative of the range of kind of resources we are planning to bring into each of these kind of published projects. And so in order to sustain it over time, where we have, what we really are aiming to show is how books develop and change over time, how they're involved in networks of scholarly communication. Just from my experience of kind of living in social networks like Twitter, I see colleagues tweeting about ideas often that they wind up developing into blog posts and articles, and I think or otherwise they publish a book and then the conversation continues in those networks. So thinking about how we can continue that conversation within the context of the book and connect them is very important. And for the University of Minnesota Press, at least, hiring someone who is acting as a digital projects editor to sustain those connections is part of the solution.
Frances, as a publisher, I was going to ask you, how does this all sound to you?
Well, I think it all sounds wonderful, actually. Whether I'm typical or not, that's another matter. But I think the Mellon Foundation has recently given a number of grants for increasing infrastructure and capacity and experimentation to the university press community. I think there are about a dozen pretty substantial grants, and then a number of smaller ones. And there are pieces that are being worked on as to how you then take the wonderful work that Matt is doing and make it sustainable. Yes, it would be lovely to carry on selling a printed book, but it's more wonderful to have those wonderful usage stats. And it's even more wonderful to have the kind of people on staff who can service the scholarly communications needs. And there are new ways of funding what I would call more of a service model rather than the traditional book model where the publisher took all the risk and then just waited to see what happened.
Augusta,
I've been quiet here just because I've been trying to figure out, how to sort of be part of this conversation from the things that interest me. And I was just looking back at some of the comments that you pre-circulated before our conversation, and was thinking about the interest in the pyramidal book, and to bring the discussion. I guess what I want to do is bring the discussion a little bit away from the sort of nuts and bolts of publication and preservation and sustainability in that sense, and take our conversation, if people are willing to go, to the question of readability, utility, audience, and those things. Because to me, part of the issue here is what's the purpose of these various different elements and the various different layers of discussion that we as scholars have. And to me, there are three layers or elements that are quite distinct. And one is the story that I want to tell, either through the historical subject that I'm focusing on, or the character or set of the period, or whatever it is, right? So there's that story. And then there's a methodological story. That is a story that I think is extremely interesting, at least I like to think, to colleagues in or around my field. So the first story has the potential to be interesting to a general public, especially if we work harder at talking about why this is an important or valuable, right, piece of information. That second methodological story, I think, is extremely important for our fields and the growth of knowledge production, generally speaking. So, and then the last one is the story of evidence. And that's the story that's, frankly, often the least interesting to people who are not deeply embedded in the specific content area that we're writing in. Yeah. And so, to try to really think carefully about the way we present our materials so that we can hit those different audiences and satisfy them at the stage they're at, instead of expecting everyone to be able to bundle along with us, through these massive archives. And I'm somebody who just loves, the most granular of details. I mean, there's no end of specifics that I, don't crave, but at the same time, I understand that most readers, and in fact, some of my the readers I most want to connect with, won't really know what to do with all that detail. Yeah. And so trying to find ways to sort of extract and express something that's, a little more tangible, a little more kind of got a little more traction with the public. And I'm not just talking about like temporizing or something like that, but really trying to understand what a reader might want to know, might need to know, and why you're the person to tell it. And sort of putting that more sort of up front in the way we develop our print, digital, whatever projects, and sort of separating those out.
Do you, in the kind of iterative scholarship we've been talking about, do you see that those second and third stories, the more expert layers, is the digital presentation kind of helpful for peeling those back and allowing people to go as far as they want to or not?
Yes, and I also think that they can be archived in a different way. So I'm thinking now about, some of the controversies that are going on at the federal level over how to have data open access that is produced through federal grants, and trying to figure out, like, well, if this material, for instance, I find it surprising that that's a controversy. If these materials are being produced under the auspices of a federal grant, why wouldn't that data be open access? I mean, why wouldn't that be the case? And yet there's a controversy surrounding that, which I find to be, somewhat perplexing. So,
as you're talking, I'm thinking about what we call a book and how the definitions are. We all talked about how that's kind of a fluid concept, and maybe has been longer than we sometimes appreciate. Are we verging beyond the book now? Are we talking about something else, some other sort of? We are talking to an audience of publishers, publishers who are specialists in certain kinds of content vessels. Are we really still talking about books?
Well, if we're going to move beyond the book, we need to look at the purpose of this scholarly content. And to date, many of the monographs have served the purpose of promotion for the academic, and a bit of less interest to a wider audience. So until the tenure process and promotion process changes, we'll still be looking at the book.
Are we seeing any signs that that's changing? And also, will tenure and promotion committees recognize something that's appearing in a digital format with all these layers as a tenurable work?
I think we are beginning to see that.
Matt, what do you think?
I think we're beginning to see some movement, but I really believe right now we're in a hybrid moment, and that we need to produce hybrid forms, and that's why you know, in our project we're thinking about the forks and where the book sort of, where the manuscript sort of forks off to become a printed artifact at one moment, and where it moves sort of web-based format in another. And that's something that's been very attractive to me, as my co-PI Doug Armato, the director of the University of Minnesota Press, you know, is encouraging us to think about the point of publication, and, you know, especially of print publication, as a moment in a larger continuum of a manuscript's kind of life. And I think as it moves from, say, the printed book onto the web to build on something, you know, Augusta was saying, what we start encountering is the reader in the space of the text itself. So through commenting, through annotation, we actually learn about what people want and how they're interacting with the text through their individual and kind of collective interactions with the text. And so I think part of it is thinking about how the printed book is obviously important and needed, but how other forms of the text can serve other uses and can be used more broadly.
And also, Matt, I mean, I would think that, you know, regarding the book as the sort of gold standard of tenure and promotion, that when you set a book-like thing into a context of the sort that you're talking about, and you have comment space and things like that, what you get to see in terms of an index is an index of your readership, and also a kind of, God forbid that I should say, impact score. So I actually think there is a way to satisfy what, frankly, I think is a very problematic system of evaluation, but yet, you know, one can't move a mountain sort of in, you know, overnight. But this type of a model that you're talking about, this kind of a iterative, you know, space, is a place to see impact and intervention involvement, and also keep the field vivid and alive and thinking about itself in terms of purpose. Because I guess that's what worries me, is that, you know, the purpose starts to be the promotion on some, you know, on some level, if we can't find a way to, like, really have these interactions and have them be substantial, robust, you know, interactions.
Mm-hmm. Let me add that part of Robert Darnton's concept of the pyramidal book was that the top level was an ordinary book, a 300-page monograph, exactly the kind of thing that a promotion and tenure committee is used to seeing and evaluating. It's the levels underneath that are new and novel, and it's not clear that a promotion and tenure committee would evaluate them on their merits, but it would hardly matter if the book at the top level was a good one. You can, one of the supplementary levels is to expand the argument in the way that Augusta was talking about. If you don't have enough time or space to give your extended analysis of some subtopic in a 300-page book, you could certainly do it in the online supplements. And then below that, you could have a layer of documentation, which might just be the digitization of a lot of records that have not previously been digitized. The Darnton model has other layers below that, and you can imagine layers that would appeal to different audiences. Again, to get back to Augusta's point, the top level is not only the shortest, but probably for that reason the one most appealing to a wider audience. But if you wanted to write a version or a summary for a popular audience or a lay audience or an audience outside the field, you could easily do that. You could even do that multiple times. And one more layer in the Darnton model was the pedagogical layer, where you include sample course handouts, sample exams, sample syllabi, and you could even open that to crowdsourcing from other people in the same field who have their own ideas about how to teach the same material.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, if I were a publisher listening to this conversation, I'd be thinking, this sounds great, but what's my role here? Beyond this sounds like scholars doing what scholars do best, which is trading their knowledge and creating an ecosystem of knowledge. Where do what sort of value can I add, and how do I stay in business, even if I'm a nonprofit, while doing that?
Well, here's a good example from just last month. Oxford University Press published a book on suicide by Margaret Batten, and it's a 700-page book, but there's a whole database of documentation hosted and preserved at the University of Utah Library. So here, partly we have an answer to the question, can publishers afford all the new infrastructure for doing this? In this case, they partnered up with the library, and kudos to the Utah Library for doing that. The publisher had to do the ordinary book part, but had to add a few extra tweaks, like QR codes on the page, so people could go straight from the printed page to the relevant text inside the database at the Utah Library.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. One very important player in this universe we're talking about is libraries.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, we really can't leave them out of this discussion. I wonder how you all see libraries most effectively either partnering with university presses or supplementing what presses and scholars are doing in the kinds of work that we've been describing. It's an open-ended question, but I'd love to have some thoughts on that.
Well, I think we should be working very, very closely with libraries. I don't think that libraries are going to completely take over the publishing functions. If they do, and they're very successful at getting the money to be channeled through libraries to do the publishing, they'll probably hire all of the unemployed publishers because they're the people who have the working skills for publishing. But I'd like to quote Caroline Brazier, who's the head of acquisitions and a director at the British Library. There's something she said to me many years ago, which I think just sums it up completely. Libraries' function is no longer about collecting, it's about connecting. And so if you start looking at their role in that sense, then there's such an active role that they can play in promoting the open access approach and being strong advocates of open access, and yes, working with these publishing experiments as well, but we'll see whether they take over a bit of the publishing space. I think there's room for lots of different types of publishing.
I would just say very briefly, while on one hand, acknowledging that there are so many, libraries come in so many sizes and have so many different configurations. What I've seen so strongly, especially at my own institution, is the role that librarians play in kind of educating the scholarly community about the value of open access and why it's important for scholars at a given institution to deposit their work in institutional repositories. And I think as a kind of force for helping educate people about the problems we sometimes find with closed access publication, librarians can be incredibly important in fostering a larger ecosystem for experimentation by university presses.
Audience, we'd love to hear questions and comments from you, so please either tweet at us or use the Q&A interface. I'm not sure we got to this question about with the rise of open access, how will this impact how much publishers are able to pay writers? And do we foresee this as a potential decline in quality of content as writers look for other outlets for their work in order to make a living? Anybody have thoughts on that?
Well, yeah. I thought that kind of talked about that earlier. I mean, in the sense that for most academic writers who are publishing with academic university presses, the pay really comes in the promotion.
Right.
But that I would also say that I guess I would welcome the idea that I might be forced to communicate with people outside of my field from time to time. And that might be a good thing for my field, actually, and that there's a level of kind of internal dialogue that goes on when it's strictly a scholarly communication. That I wouldn't say it will lessen the quality of the discussion. I just think it will change the terms somewhat. And going back to this earlier idea of really focusing on what the purpose of that narrative would be, so. That's just my response.
I think you've distinguished between the financial issues and the quality issues very well. I would just add that in-going open access and in-going digital, there'll still be quality controls, whatever format those things take, because that's certainly something that the academic community is asking of publishers to continue doing. And as Peter mentioned earlier, the actual sales of something that is called a book can often be greater because the open access, the promotion piece, the marketing piece, it's the same principle as Amazon, the look inside, or Google. You can go in and see a bit and you say, oh, I really want to hold this thing in my hands and my own copy, and people will still pay for that. For how long? Who knows? But at the moment, in the immediate future, it's looking fine.
We have a question from Twitter, which is, since Mellon has funded so many of these experiments, what will it take to make the results interoperable? I'm not entirely sure what interoperable means in this context, but I think basically, a lot of money going into these experiments. When are we going to see results that can be shared? What are we learning from this sort of multi-partner experience?
Well, I would just say that so Minnesota's grant is part of, I think, the most recent set of Mellon grants, and there was actually a collaborative discussion before grant proposals were finalized and plans set in motion for testing out platforms across multiple publishers. So to some extent that's planned and already happening. Having said that, I think there's always a challenge when you have a bunch of platforms and experiments being created. It's something, having work be interoperable across them is going to take time and effort. And I've seen Mellon is very interested in fostering those conversations actively. So I think we have reason to be hopeful about not winding up with a set of kind of separate, disconnected publishing experiments, but rather conscious thought and conversation about how the various experiments can connect with one another.
Sounds like, sorry, here I'm just looking. In other words, does Manifold play well with what West Virginia University is doing and Stanford's doing and so on? I mean, is there other people building something similar or something that might be parallel? Can they all work together eventually?
I don't think that there's necessarily a vision or a plan in place for everything to kind of work together, but I do think selected projects are finding ways to connect with other projects funded through these grants and that are kind of going at different things. I think a lot of the projects that are funded through this grant cycle are aiming to address different parts of the open access monograph spectrum. So while I don't think every single project will connect to each other, I do think we'll see productive points of connection.
I also think, I mean, I don't know enough about these others to speak authoritatively, but I guess like just taking a long view and looking back historically, I mean, publishing has always been an unstable business. It's been a risky business. It's been an experimental business. It's been a business filled with people who are really dedicated to the ideas and the kind of connections that ideas can make. And so, to me, I almost, I'm thinking Manifold, West Virginia University, Stanford. These will all be iterations of an idea, just like we've had, so many different platforms that we've used to build digital collections, and we sort of mix and match, and this project calls for this one, and that project calls for that one. And what's beautiful about this is that there are a number of institutions or groups that are moving in a direction so that we actually have multiple resources and possibilities, which to me kind of brings us back to the book, which has taken multiple formats, aside from the fact that, like, okay, you've got covers, I mean, there have just been so many different ways in which a book becomes a book and circulates as such. So to me, there's just so much that resonates with the history of publishing, at least in this country as far as I understand it, and our current moment.
I think that's
never been comfortable. It's never been easy.
No, but this is such an exciting moment. We have never had so much opportunity. Even just 2 years ago, when I ran the first pilot of Knowledge Unlatched, the biggest criticism I had were people saying, well, but it doesn't solve that problem. And you can't unlatch textbooks, so I'm not interested. And you can't do this, you can't do that. And I said, look, I'm addressing one small issue, which please help me get this pilot off the ground. But now, as a result of that, and other people just persevering, it's become acceptable to experiment with a number of different projects. And we're really hoping that the people who are working in this space, personally, I don't care which models win out ultimately. I just know that the characteristics should be that they should be sustainable, that they should be fair and transparent, and that we get the best scholarship out there, because not only do we want it out there, we want to get it from out there. The world has so much good scholarship out there which cannot get into the elite English language university presses. And open access begins to level the playing field, and that's what's so exciting about it, and the contribution to knowledge and speeding up that interchange. It's terrific.
And I would just say, I think crucial to this also, this is something we're really trying to emphasize with Manifold, is in addition to open access, open source, and kind of public experimentation that highlights the process of development. So that, and this is, Mellon requires open source as part of its grant, so the tools will always be open source at the end, but we're trying to draw potential readers and users of our platform into the process of creation as we go along, in part by sharing our code openly on GitHub as we're working, creating Docker containers so that when the tool is built, others can kind of install it quickly and can spin out new instances of Manifold. But central to it is kind of, for us at least, is kind of telling the story of how we're building it as we're building it, which I think is analogous to how we imagine open scholarship, that what we want on the scholarly side is to showcase how scholars are thinking through their ideas rather than just sort of winding up at the finished product of the text.
Right. As if some crazy miracle of birth. I mean, I think that's the fascinating thing, with Frances, some of the things that you were saying a moment ago, where, being that provocative and drawing that kind of fire is a sign of life. And these kinds of conflicts, as scholars, what we do is argue and debate. That's what we do. And that's really, frankly, one of the biggest values we bring. And I think it's really kind of a wonderful moment, and I think here we're all in agreement in the sense that suddenly we're like actually down to the material ways that we do our work, not just the work in this sort of ethereal intellectual space, but also, you know, the hard tacks of exactly how it's going to work. And I can't see how that won't contribute, frankly, to the depth of our knowledge and our interactions with each other and the public. That just seems to me like has to be a good thing. So, this is an exciting time, just because it's provocative on a certain level, because it's making us have to really rethink what the purpose of our discourse is, what we're really trying to do with it, and what kind of value we bring to the public and those around us. So that seems to me all positive, even if it's painful and difficult at times.
I think we all remember the transition from print to ebooks. Even if you didn't make the transition yourselves, you knew people who refused to make it.
Right.
Serious book readers who just made it a point of pride not to read a book on a screen. I think in retrospect, now 10 years later or so, we can say they were not offended by the idea of text or hardware. They just had habits that they were reluctant to break. And it takes a decade or two for people to break their habits. I think we're going to see the same thing with all the innovations in book technology and books themselves that we're talking about today. People have habits, people have expectations about what counts as a book, but as soon as we see the new examples and see how they serve our purposes, they deepen inquiry, they serve conversation, they reach readers, they increase impact, then we'll get over the old habits and the old expectations, and we'll recognize these things for what they are. They serve our purposes. We'll value them more than we do now.
So is there still going to be a place for I hate to use the phrase closed access because that just sounds bad, but the classic small audience print monograph, the kind of things that university presses have really been the only home for a long time. Not every scholarly project is going to have mass appeal. Not everybody's going to want to drill down into 1,200 data sets or a lot of primary source material. What about the sort of classic university press model of a small run library to audience book? Is that going to stay alive?
I would say, first of all, open access is not just for books with mass appeal. It's for books with narrow appeal. If you're only writing for other scholars, you still have to recognize that not all scholars work at institutions with libraries with budgets large enough to buy the book. So if you want them to have access, you have to make it open. But even if you have reasons to make it closed, I think all closed books, let's call them print-only books, should become open at a certain point in their life. There's no reason to keep them closed forever. And one solution to the backfile problem of a university press is to release the texts openly. And by the way, let me call on presses again to keep track of sales data when they do that. If sales decline to a certain point where they think they're finally justified in making it open, then follow the sales after that point. And I think much of the time they'll see a little spike because suddenly it's visible to more people who can search it and sample it and say to themselves, this is what I want, this is relevant to my work, this is good, I want a copy.
So it sounds like more data, some real data on sales figures would be good, or at least patterns.
Can I just add something? Can I just add something to what Peter is saying? I think that the more narrow a book is, the more it needs open access, because that narrow book, the cost of selling the closed model into the handful of libraries that will buy that book is huge. Mm-hmm. And the narrower the focus, the higher the cost per book of getting it into the specialist library. Mm-hmm. And those are the sorts of books that we really should be making open access from the start, because if they are closed from the start, it's very hard to see how people will start talking about them, because nobody will know that they're there except for those people who are very privileged to have access to those very wealthy libraries. So I would argue that it's just as important to get new books out there open and find the models and I don't know how many of Peter's 14 models will work well for new books, but I'm going to look it up and see what I think. But I'm sure there are many ways of getting the new books out there. But I also agree that with the backlist, there's a real issue that we'll end up with the same problem as we do with copyright, with that extended period where they stay closed before they go into the public domain. And again, there should be programs to enable backlists to go open and see what happens.
I think we may be coming back around to the money question. Who's going to support those programs and pay for them? We have Mellon, of course, you know, the Goliath of scholarly publishing, but that's one vision and one set of coffers, deep as they are. Should scholarly societies be jumping in more here? Library-based open access funds, presses can't do it alone. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Just anybody who's a stakeholder should be just pulling out a little bit of money. When we first launched KU, a small theological college came along and said, we don't have the money, we only have 100 students, and we would like to support you. Could we pay you $1 per student? Oh, that wasn't enough to unlatch the collection, but the idea that if for every student in the world, the university spent $1, everything would be open.
I would just add, I think it has been interesting for me as a kind of literature language scholar to see the role that, for instance, the MLA Modern Language Association has been playing as a publisher, particularly through its MLA Commons. I'm involved with a book project there called Digital Pedagogy and the Humanities, that's sort of sharing work, draft work first on GitHub, and then doing open peer review on the MLA Commons site. And the final version will be a kind of born digital book on the MLA Commons. But what's just been so interesting to me is to see how, again, the sort of the conception of the book and of the project from the beginning is involved with communities and networks. And I think that's where that MLA vision is important and perhaps instructive, which is that we really need to start thinking about the networks around books, the social networks, the academic networks around books, and how they can be kind of mobilized both in the book's creation and in its publishing and in its kind of afterlife.
Peter, are universities stepping up and doing enough to support some of these experiments?
That's not clear. First, as I say, roughly 25% of American university presses are already experimenting with full-text open access books. I commend them for that. There are other proposals for universities to contribute to the costs, and I think the uptake is uneven. And I don't have good data on whether a sufficient number of universities are chipping in or whether they're not, or whether, if not, it's because the models themselves are flawed. But we are in a period of flux, and people are proposing different models. Some are better than others, but all of them seem to require asking universities to chip in. And I'm in a university now that receives these requests all the time, and even though we have a sizable budget, we can't say yes to them all. And it's very hard when there are new proposals to figure out which ones are the promising ones, which ones deserve our investment. But I can say there's willingness to invest in a superior alternative. There's willingness to spend limited library money on a better model. But there are so many models now that are asking for subsidy that it's hard to pick them.
And isn't it also true that, I mean, this is a moving target in the sense that as almost, I mean, I don't mean to be melodramatic, but almost as each day passes, we start to wonder, how do we want to reshape and reform the fields that we are each individually and collectively in? And what are the tools that we're going to need to continue to build a knowledge base and expand intellectual communication? So it seems to me like, again, like this kind of, there's a chicken and an egg kind of thing that goes back to an earlier part of our conversation, which is just a sort of necessary feature of the way this is a constant negotiation and a level of flux that just won't allow the kind of stasis that to me, and forgive me, but it just doesn't, I just don't see that stasis ever really being there. I see us always wanting it, on a certain level, because we need to build and move and all that. But it just seems to me like this is really a fluid, a fact of scholarly communication should by definition be its fluidity. The questions that are not fluid are the disciplinary standards and the sort of ultimate bedrock of knowledge, and I'm going to have to just put that in quotes for the moment because that's kind of a different question. But that's really what will remain, I think, and the formats themselves just by definition have to evolve and change to serve, right, the purposes that we want to put these different productions to.
I think that's going to be a good note to end on. We've hit 4 o'clock, and I'm told it's time to wrap it up. So if anybody has any final parting thoughts they want to share before we log off, let me know.
I just want to thank you and the AAUP for convening this discussion. It's I think, as Augusta was saying, we're at an incredible moment of experimentation right now and of change, and it's great to hear these thoughts about where we're going and to think about I think the role that university presses can and should play as we move forward.
Absolutely. So grateful to have had this chance to interact with all of you, and thank you so much, Jen, for the thoughtfulness and care that you put into bringing us together and fleshing out these, kind of gnarly issues. Thank you so much.
It's an ongoing conversation. I've really enjoyed hearing everybody's thoughts on it, and I'm sure we will continue this in different venues.
I'd like to thank the AAUP as well, and Jen for moderating, and to all the panelists. Thank you all.
Thank you.
And I'll just echo all those thanks.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.